Amos N. Wilson.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. I appreciate your applause and your welcome. And I hope I did not have you waiting too long here, so I was going down the wrong direction. I'd have to sort of remind my good brother that the address is 838 East 165th Street, right? Instead of 838 Prospect Avenue. So I was headed in the right direction instinctually. I know this neighborhood, and then I saw numbers, and I went back the other way. So then I had to come back across again. So yeah, so I noticed it is 838, but the 838 is for 165th Street. Well, I won't hold you too much here this evening, but I'm sorry we don't have a lectern, huh? No? Okay. I'm sort of more used to sort of standing, and I think, is that one? No, I don't. Yeah. Okay. Okay, this evening we're going to talk a little bit, not so much directly about the mind as I'd like to, because to be honest with you, I'm sort of in the middle of trying to complete the final lecture in the upcoming book of lectures, Blueprint for Black Power. And often it's difficult when you're really concentrating and writing to sort of pull yourself out of a mode of thought and sort of move directly into another, particularly rapidly. Even though I think the things I will talk about today will have some relevance. Of course, whenever we talk about man, we talk about mind, and of course when we talk about ourselves, we talk about minds that have been transformed by our experience. I'm going to talk today a bit about what I call assimilationist fantasies, multiculturalism, racial harmony, and the future of the African American community. Thank you. Thank you very much. I see Brother yourself is here, and I had the good luck of being with him last Sunday. He'll hear a little bit of what he heard last Sunday out at the African Portrait Theater when we talked a good deal about awakening the natural genius of black children, and where we talked a bit about fantasies. I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about that today. I tried to demonstrate in last week's lecture at the African Portrait Theater that to a good extent we are subject to several types of fantasies that have prevented us from seeing reality and from dealing with reality. I want to pay some obeisance to the day of Dr. King's assassination, sort of beginning this a little bit, and just to mention his legacy in the sense that I admired his struggle for what I might call human dignity. While there are those of us who may certainly not be in line with some of his ideological stances, I don't think we would disagree over the fact that he struggled mightily for the dignity of African people and for African American people in this country today. He struggled to reveal our humanity to ourselves and to the world, and of course to gain us certain basic citizenship rights, and encourage us to stand on our feet and to demand what our human rights and to demand that we be heard and that we gain those rights that are ours as human beings, not because they're just civil rights or legal rights guaranteed by the so-called U.S. Constitution, but because they are rights that should be granted to any human being. The thing that I admire most about Dr. King, of course, is that he had the courage of his convictions. Regardless as to whether we may agree or disagree with the ideology or not, I think, again, we must admire the fact that here is a man who put his life on the line for what he believed. It is easy for those of us who may not agree to hide out and to talk in safe places. But the reality and the moment of truth occurs when we're willing to confront dangers and other things to try to realize our convictions. Those of us who have different ideologies from that of King then must take courage from his example, and we must then demonstrate the courage of our convictions. All too often, we hear people talking about Malcolm X making some kind of change or toward the end of his life. We also get a similar bit of information about Martin Luther King. As a matter of fact, I've seen some of the later speeches that we don't hear much of that indicate very clearly that Dr. King was arriving at what I perceive as a more realistic view of the nature of this nation and the nature of this world, and perhaps again was ready to enter into a new phase of activity and to perhaps change the ideology a bit and to move toward economic and political development based more on a sense of African identity. The thing, though, that I'm mainly concerned with, though, is many of people who took from King's philosophy an ideology that I call a fantasy, what I've called the assimilationist fantasy. To a good degree, you can see the response to Dr. King's speech in Washington as indicative of the fact that he spoke to a collective fantasy, a set of dreams by our people at that time. One of the measures of fantasies is when you find a leader who is charismatic, not only because he may speak well or she may speak well or has an oratorical style, but because they articulate something in the hearts and minds of the masses of the people. And the response of African Americans to King's famous speech would indicate that he articulated a fantasy that was shared by a large percentage of our population. This fantasy I've referred to as a compensatory fantasy, a fantasy that seeks to compensate for the injuries done to our collective egos as African people. We tend to think of children as being involved a great deal in fantasy, but we must recognize that fantasies are things that are with us throughout our lives, and that we, even as adults, are guided by very powerful fantasies. As I indicated before, although there are a number of types of fantasies and a number of ways fantasies serve us both positively and negatively, we are primarily concerned with what I call the compensatory fantasies, because I believe that these types of fantasies retard our growth and destroy our genius as African people. I've indicated that fantasies are perceived as what we call ego defense mechanisms in psychology. That is the means by which we try to defend ourselves against disappointment, against failure, against threat, against stress, anxiety, and fear. These emotions are highly upsetting and unpleasant, and certainly we try to bring them to an end as soon as we possibly can. We have mental means by which we try to reduce their intensity or to eliminate them, period. Some of the methods we use are methods that rely on the distortion of reality, of the denial of reality, of deceiving ourselves, or lying to ourselves, or backing back or retreating into our imagination and into dreamland, imagining the world to be what it is not, living under the influence of wishful thinking and hope, which will not see reality. This is what we mean when we talk about defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are designed to massage our egos and to reduce the pain of our egos, but not to solve the problems which cause the pain to our egos and ourselves as people. Which means then, while we may feel no pain, the disease that is destroying us will continue to eat us alive. And ultimately, we may suffer death and damnation, even though we might feel good to ourselves. Many of the remedies that we see in the drugstores and other areas are what we call pain relievers or symptomatic pain relievers. They relieve the symptoms of disease without curing the disease itself. And to a great extent then, ego defense mechanisms are pain relievers. They soothe us, but the disease and the problems that are the cause of our pain continues and ultimately may destroy us. Fantasies then are one of the major means by which we soothe our egos and the means by which we relieve our pain. We readily use ego mechanisms such as fantasies because they conveniently and often effectively soften our failures and reduce conflicting thoughts and feelings and emotions and so forth. They alleviate anxiety, and they help us to maintain our feelings of competence and worth. But as I've indicated earlier, reality continues to be what it is. I argued then in our last lecture at the African Portrait Theater that to a great extent, I believe many of our people responded to the articulations of Dr. King, particularly the ones where he talked about our assimilation with white folk. When he talked about little white boys and black boys holding hands and those other fantasies, I think he spoke then to our own collective fantasies where we assumed that we could get over our pain as a people by merging with our enemies. We, like abused children, while being abused, were made to think that our abuse was the result and is the result of our color. It is the result of who we are as people and not the result of the insane person who is doing the abuse. When we are being abused often, those people who abuse us seek to convince us that our pain is the result of our being different from them. And that if we were like them, if we thought if we talked like them, we looked like them, dressed like them, then we would not suffer. And therefore we have some people who tell themselves when they suffer from the pains of the madness and neurosis of Europeans and the sickness that Europeans represent in the world today, we hear our people saying, they did it to me because I was black. This means that we leave then those who persecute us and exploit us and hurt us in all kinds of ways to appear to be normal, innocent. It is only our skin color, our differentness, that's the cause of the problem, not their madness and not their psychopathology and their illness. And we can only think this, ladies and gentlemen, and we can recognize this when we tell ourselves we want to be just like the people who destroy us. We want our children to go to school with the people who discriminate against us, who have enslaved us, who lynch us, and do all of the other things. And then we want to say, well, I want my child to be just like them. This speaks then to the depth of our own distorted minds and our own distorted fantasies. But it is understandable in terms of what I've said earlier to a degree. When we have been convinced that we are suffering because we are different, then it becomes understandable that we wish to end our suffering by trying not to be different, by trying to convince those who injure us and destroy us not to see us as black, even though we may be realistically black right in front of their faces. And tell them to look at us as if we are some kind of abstraction. We are not flesh and blood and dark skin and brown skin and what have you. We are not flesh and blood with our lips and our hair and so forth. We are just a man, just a person, just an American, an abstraction. We want them to act as if they're incapable of seeing color and incapable of discriminating color in the world. Ultimately, on a deeper psychological level, some of us then would hope to even merge into them and to become one with them, to no longer exist as a black people, to no longer be perceived in any distinctive way from other folk, and particularly from whites. We, in a sense then, in our pain, wish to become invisible and to commit biological and psychological suicide, to deny ourselves and to deny our identity in the hope of escape and in the hope of gaining what we perceive as the benefits of white society and European so-called civilization. This is a fantasy, as I had pointed out before, and it is a compensatory fantasy that is bound to fail. It will never be realized. And I will talk to you later about it. And even if it were, what people who had any pride in themselves, who have love for self, would want to disappear in the eyes of other people, and who would want to disappear in their own eyes? What level of self-hatred and self-alienation must exist in us that we would wish to see our lives fade away from this earth? What self-hatred and self-alienation would have us overlook reality? If you think racism is the major basis for conflict in the world, you could not be more wrong. The dream of some coffee-colored people will not end your pain. In South Africa, they got a group of coffee-colored people, and they just put them in a different category, didn't they? They called them coloreds. And so the society still stratifies itself. If you know anything about genetics, it would be hundreds and thousands of years before you get a milk-colored race. In the meanwhile, you're going to still have the various shades of color, from light to dark. And knowing mankind, he will use those shades as a basis for establishing domination. And even when the shades disappear, there will exist class. There will exist culture. We have races of people today that you cannot tell apart, who still have the same genetic basis, but who still have a reason to fight and kill each other. Either reasons of religion or history or some other circumstance, reasons of class and whatever. You shall not escape pain by trying to escape into your white masters and merge into the white man. You may as well face the reality. The ultimate way of getting rid of pain is to get rid of its cause, not to hide in a state of self-deception. Fantasy is present when the individual or group responds emotionally to ideas, values, and ideologies in ways which endanger his or its well-being and future survival. I'm trying to kind of give you a few measures of when you can tell when a person is caught up in a psychopathological fantasy. You see, when the individual responds emotionally and vigorously to ideas and to concepts and values and ideologies, which, if pursued, places the individual in danger, places their very survival in question, then you know that you're dealing with an individual who has been taken over and possessed by a fantasy. And therefore you have to look at people and their ideologies and look at what place their ideology puts them and judge their ideology against the reality of their circumstances. This is the kind of thing we deal with the psychologists every day, with people who come in filled with fantasies and beliefs, attached tenaciously to ideologies and hopes, and yet those fantasies, beliefs, ideologies, and hopes are depressing them, destroying their families, making it impossible for them to love, make it impossible for them to realize themselves and to achieve what their potentialities would allow them to achieve, were they not caught up in curious games, caught up in ideologies and fantasies that ultimately lead many to engage in self-destructive behavior, in various types of addictions, leads them to engage in behaviors that hurt and destroy other people, as well as hurt and destroy themselves. To a great extent, what we call neuroses in psychology is more starkly described as stupidity, where the person continues to hold on to ideas even though they get hurt over and over and over again, where on a certain level you wonder why they can see that the beliefs are not advancing their interests but actually working against their interests, and yet they continue to persist to the point sometimes of destruction or the destruction of others. So we not only recognize then that individuals can have these kind of fantasies that send them to psychiatrists and psychologists and ministers and other people, but people also can be in the throes of collective fantasies that place themselves as a people in danger and places their very life as a people in question. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, African people the world over, African American people's lives are in question today. And the survival of African people on this globe is a serious question at this moment. If you do not believe this, then chances are you too are wrapped up in a fantasy that has cut you off from the reality of what is going on in the world. We recognize that a fantasy is present then when the subject of that fantasy ultimately believes in ideas which are obviously contradicted by reality, facts, and events. The hallmark of normality and the very foundation of being able to survive is being able to know what is real from the unreal, and being able to base one's behavior on reality, and to test one's beliefs and ideas against reality, and to readjust one's beliefs and ideas in terms of the information one gets from reality. I am not arguing against the holding on to ideals and the striving for ideals, but the striving for ideals should be clearly demarcated from what is real. And one then should not confuse the ideals for which one strives with what is in reality. For when that occurs, then one is subject to serious injury, psychologically, if not physically. Many of our people then caught up in the ideology of assimilationism have misread reality and projected a type of stupidity that is appalling, that will ultimately place us in jeopardy of our lives as people. As I said earlier, this is somewhat understanding because we have a name for this kind of phenomenon in psychology too. We call it identification with the aggressor. Love for the aggressor. Isn't it intriguing to ask why, after these centuries of enslavement, these centuries of Jim Crowism, racial discrimination, lynching, these centuries of unrelenting violence against our people physically and psychologically, these centuries of injustice and every other thing you can talk about, why is it that black folk want to be just like white folk? Why we see our ultimate goal as that of living with these people who cause us so much pain, of sending our children to school with them, of seeing their love as the final verification of our manhood and womanhood and personhood as a people. Isn't it amazing that after all of this suffering, we do not see ourselves as concretely existing and as being real and whole human beings until we are perceived and recognized by white folk? Love for the aggressor. An interesting phenomenon in psychology. We see it and we saw it in the Jewish concentration camps, where many Jews and certain Jews walked around in the concentration camps with Nazi armbands on, talked to their people and treated their people as if they themselves were Nazis, and became allies with their Nazi captors against the interests of their fellow prisoners. Again, of course, we are seeing people who are seeking to escape their pain and guilt and shame by trying to become one with their persecutors, who think then that if they can become one, they will escape from their persecution. This is when we're dealing with fantasies. And yet, those people under that camp did not get rescued from their pain. They were still in prison. They still helped to maintain their people in prison and work against the interests of their own people and ultimately against their own interests. We have a bunch of people here today in this country who are in a similar position. They're sitting with Clinton today. We have one that even leads the U.S. Army. And yet when we look at the reality of this gentleman, we see that his major acts have been to lead the U.S. armies against black nations. We see him writing out great plans which provide the military and other means by which the white North, the European North, shall continue to dominate the black South. A man who I dare say has not sent one military weapon to South Africa, will not provide one bit of military training for the liberation of our people anywhere in the world. A man who may be ignorant and possibly not, but I assume he is, of the fact that because you rise to head an army, a national army, does not mean that you're a part of the power system. If he'd read back into African history and into history in general, he will recognize that he is not the first slave general of an army. Many armies have been led by slaves and even armed by slaves. So the idea that you may head an army, that you may be the top general, in no way implies that you're not a slave and that you're not set up to work against the interests of our people. Many Arabized Africans fought against other Africans to try to convince them to undertake a foreign ideology and to fall victim to foreign rulers and dominators. There is no substitute for self-sufficiency and for operating under one's own power. But people caught up in fantasy let their emotional needs for love, their emotional need for acceptance, their emotional need to be embraced by their enemies override their common sense. These people, as I pointed out in our last lecture, neglect their own self-development. They do not see the development of their minds, the development of their intellect, the development of their social relations and social organizations and social systems and power, the development of their own institutions as important and key to their liberation. They see gaining the love and acceptance of their enemies as the key to being liberated from their pain. And therefore they leave themselves in serious states of underdevelopment. Their minds are trophy. Their social institutions rarely get built or are anemic or fall apart. And they continue to languish in states and stages of dependency. This is still the way we see, and this is the reality of our people that we see today. That's one of the reasons why I've said that the great genius of African children, which I've demonstrated in the book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, in Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children, in those books I have demonstrated that black children have a natural head start. That they are not only different from white children merely by the color of their skins, but that they are born intellectually more advanced than whites. That they have greater natural capacities for learning in their childhood than whites. But these differences are overlooked. These intellectual potentialities are unfed and unmet and undeveloped by people whose whose minds are overridden by an emotional attachment to their enemies, who wish to deliver these children over to their enemies, even though their enemies have told them time and time again that they hate the very sight of them. That's right, brother. That they do not even want them to live next door. And they wish that they were not even existent in the world today. But we insist on placing them under the instruction of these people, and then we are surprised as to why they do not learn, and as to why they come out and destroy themselves in the thousands of ways that we see them do every day, time after time. But you see, people who want to merge, who want to lose themselves in their enemies, do not want anything black to stand up, because it would remind them of their separateness. So no matter how good a black school would be, they don't want it to exist, because they want to rid themselves of their blackness, which they think is the cause of their problem. No matter how much you talk about black economic development, they don't want that to exist, because they call that self-segregation. And they see the worst thing that could happen to them is to be separated from their white masters. And we see a people then constantly engaged in self-denial. But reality begins to creep in. Let's look at this generation after the assimilationist fantasies possessed our minds. Not that it does not still continue to possess many of our minds today. And what have we recognized as a people who tried to turn fantasy into reality, who permitted our fantasies to blind us to reality? What have we arrived at today as a people? Have we achieved merger with our enemies? Do they not any longer see us as black people, as various types of stereotypes? Are we yet not now more segregated in the inner cities than we were before? Are we not now more segregated in our schools than we were before? Are we not now more unemployed than we were before? Are we not now populating the prisons of America much more than we were before? Are we not now much more addicted to drugs and various other injurious habits than we were before? Are we now not more subject to racial strife than we were before? Is not criminality rampant in our neighborhoods? Are not our children not learning as much as they did before? What did that fantasy gain us? What did this striving for merger with our enemies gain us? Some of us then have started to come a bit to reality. We recognize then, some 40 years almost after the 1954 Supreme Court decision, that the largest percentage of us are no better off, and many of us are worse off than we were at that time. After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves as a people without an educational agenda, still stumbling around trying to find out the best methods for educating our children, still struggling with concepts of African-centered education, multicultural education, integrated education, Head Start, and all the other nefarious and multitudes of programs and projects and titles and entitlements that have only left us confused and basically ignorant and left our problems unresolved. After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves without a cultural agenda. Who are we? Where are we? Where are we going? Where did we come from? After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves without an economic agenda, suffering economically. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because the economic situation of African people in the world today is alarming and will soon get worse. Oh yeah, there's some of you out there can point to a few Negroes who've made it up. You know, a part of fantasy is to believe in fairy tales. And one of the standard endings of fairy tales is, and they live happily ever after. So that was this great fantasy, a part of the assimilationist fantasy that said, you know, once we integrate with white folk, and once we go to school with them, and once we break down the barriers to employment and all this other kind of stuff, we will live happily ever after. And yet, you know, history did not justify this belief at all. As I've said on many occasions, people progress in history, but they also what? Regress. All of this happens in history. People may integrate in history, but they also do what? Disintegrate in history as well. Black Americans believe in the American idea of progress, that things must necessarily get better than they were before. Who told you that lie? There is no law in the universe that promises any individual or any people that things necessarily get better than they were before. We've seen nations and peoples and civilizations do what? Rise, mature, and what? Fall. We've seen literally races and ethnic groups disappear from the face of this earth. We can witness on this very continent the near decimation of the Native American. We can look at our own history, the history of the Reconstruction era, the history of the 1870s and 1880s, when blacks could vote, when blacks were elected to Senate, when blacks were elected to Congress, when blacks were parts of state legislatures, when blacks were sheriffs, when blacks headed corporations, when blacks had strong civil rights legislation. And yet, all of this was taken from us. And it took literally 100 years for black people to get the same thing back. If the law says that progress is the only thing that happened in the world, then we should not have been struggling for voting rights in the 1960s, because we had them in the 1870s. You see? We should not have been struggling for civil rights and the other things in the 1960s and 70s. We had them in the late 1860s and 70s. So our own history refutes the idea then that people live happily ever after, and that once they achieve a particular status and position in society, they are destined to maintain that position and only to go higher. We failed to learn a lesson then, as we are failing to learn the lesson now. We failed to learn the fact that laws do not protect anyone, that laws are not sacred, that laws are merely rules laid down by people who are strong enough to enforce them. And they're laid down to maintain their interests as a people against other people. And that they will make and unmake laws when it suits their interests to do so. And yet we have a bunch of black people who sit around here thinking that because they have civil rights laws on the books, because the Supreme Court ruled in their favor at one point, because they have some other kinds of human rights organizations, that they now are protected. The law is no stronger than its enforcement. And when the enforcement of the law is left in the hands of other people, then those people, when they choose not to enforce the law, can jeopardize us as a people. Or when they choose, can reverse the law. Look at this, what is happening today with the New York Post. At one point, Murdoch is told that he has to sell the New York Post because it is against the law for a person to own two major communications media in the same market. He could not own Channel 5 and be a major person in the Fox network and own the New York Post simultaneously. He had to let one go, so he let the Post go. And now what do we hear? The very governor himself and other people who even made the law now saying that they will do what? Sweep the law aside. Why? Because it is in their interest to do so. Because they need that scandal sheet and that rag to continue to degrade African American people. They need it during the next election campaign because it does the dirty work of the New York media as a whole. So while the New York Times can pretend that it is above the fray and that it is objective, and while the Daily News can dance around, they will let the Post say all the dirty things that they dare not say. But they're all in cahoots against the empowerment of African people. And we have not learned a lesson yet that the only thing that ultimately protects the people and protects the interests of the people is that they have the power to protect themselves and to defend themselves against the incursions of their enemies. They cannot protect themselves by depending upon the laws made by their enemies and laws enforced by their enemies. We did not learn that lesson during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And it appears that we have not learned that lesson during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And therefore, we are vulnerable to suffer the same setbacks. And as a matter of fact, we may suffer even worse setbacks in the future. We must be aware then of what our reality is and look upon our history as a check against our fantasies. The placing of blacks in these high positions will no more provide for the advancement of African people. It's a major situation, by the way, and very typical of bourgeois rule. To get the average person and to get the masses to believe that their own individual advancement represents an advancement for the race. Yeah. So their promotion to particular positions means, ain't we moved forward in the world? And yet I ask people basic questions. How many nickels have the advancement of many of our bourgeois people put in your pocket? How much has the average black man and woman and the quality of life for the masses of African people been improved by the movement of one black person or 10 black persons from one good job to another? We are supposed somehow to live through these people vicariously while we starve on these streets and we go unsalaried and unemployed. And we are to believe then that the advancement of some few of us represents the advancement of the rest of us. But let's check this fantasy against reality. And we can almost see a direct relationship between the number of black elected officials and the suffering of African people. As I pointed out before, we've lamented the death of Thurgood Marshall, but I find it interesting that he got more out of the Supreme Court while he was a lawyer than when he was a justice sitting on the bench. In fact, it is sort of interesting that he sat on the bench only to watch many of his achievements rolled back by that court before which he practiced. We got a black man who was the Secretary of Health, only to see the black community be devastated by drugs and tuberculosis and AIDS and other kinds of diseases. We get a black man who became the Secretary of Housing, and at the very point he sat in the seat, homelessness plagued and devastated the black community. We see men and women sitting on our courts around the world, and we see men and women who are district attorneys in our county courthouses. And at the point where we see an increase in the district attorneys, the black district attorneys in our courthouses, we see more black men doing what? Going to jail. And as we sit more judges on the benches in various courts, we see the prisons being overrun with black men. Where is this promise then that sitting our black bourgeoisie on the courts of these cities and counties, that putting our black bourgeoisie on the seats of the U.S. Supreme Court would somehow reduce the nature of crime in our communities? We must wake up to reality. Some of us are beginning to wake up. Some evidence that some new, more healthy fantasy may be taking place is, of course, the movement of many toward the memory of Malcolm X. But I'm not all too sure. But it does indicate that some people looking at the reality of our situation and looking for perhaps a different model, a different ideology, a different way of dealing with that reality. But you see, those who are dominant rule by advancing fantasies, by promoting fantasies. The fantasies laid on African people by the NAACP, by the Urban League, and by other assimilationist organizations were funded to a great extent by whites and Europeans. And while one major group would not support